Millionaire disguises himself as a waiter and enters his own hotel. A week later, he is horror-filled when Marcus Thorne's life had always been an uninterrupted sequence of triumphs, each victory larger than the last, each deal struck with ruthless precision. His five-star hotel, the Ascendant, was his masterpiece. A towering edifice of wealth and status nestled right in the heart of Manhattan, and the crown jewel of his sprawling empire. Known to the world as a visionary billionaire with a cold, calculating mind, Marcus was the embodiment of success. He had everything, or at least that's what the world thought. But beneath his immaculate exterior, a sense of discontent had begun gnawing at him, a feeling he couldn't shake no matter how many new ventures he conquered. It was this sense of restlessness that led Marcus to devise a plan both bold and unusual for a man of his standing. Inspired by stories of incognito CEOs and tales of wealth and power subverted, he decided he would step away from the gilded office suit and take on the role of a hotel waiter. Disguised, anonymous, and unseen among the staff of his own hotel. For an entire week, he would live among his employees, eat the same meals, perform the same tasks, and see his guests and staff not through the lens of a billionaire, but as a nameless server on the hotel floor. On a misty autumn morning, just after dawn, Marcus arrived at the Ascendant, feeling a thrill that he hadn't experienced in years. He wore a black, nondescript uniform, the same as any other waiter, and left his phone, watch, and other belongings behind, reducing himself to anonymity. His typical aura of control was masked by the humble attire, and even his posture seemed to transform as he hunched slightly, as if taking on an unfamiliar weight. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of his purpose, to see the undercurrents that powered his empire, and perhaps understand a part of himself he'd neglected for far too long. After a brief meeting with the only two people who knew his plan, Leona, his trusted head of security, and Peter, the assistant manager who would act as his mentor and supervisor for the week, Marcus was ready to begin. "You're sure about this?" Peter asked, eyeing him warily. Marcus's nod was curt. "No special treatment, no exceptions. I want to experience the reality." Peter, a seasoned assistant manager with a compassionate but wary face, understood. "All right. We start you off in the lobby lounge. It's demanding, especially with our high-profile guests, but you'll get to see everything up close." The hustle of the lounge was overwhelming, even for a man accustomed to high-stakes boardrooms and intense negotiations. Within moments of arriving, Marcus found himself fumbling with a tray, his hands clumsy as he tried to balance multiple cups and dishes. For a man who had long controlled every detail of his environment, the chaos of waiting tables was a humbling experience. He couldn't keep up with the other waiters, who moved with practiced fluidity, their eyes sharp and their steps quick. Marcus's first customer was a man whose name and face he didn't recognize, but who carried himself with the unmistakable air of the wealthy and entitled. Dressed in an immaculately tailored suit, he lounged on one of the plush seats and ordered a complicated espresso drink with a dismissive flick of his wrist. As Marcus brought the drink over, he miscalculated his footing and spilled a small splash onto the man's newspaper. The man glared up, his expression a mixture of surprise and outrage. "Are you new here?" he snapped, wiping at the paper with a look of disgust. Marcus's face grew hot as he mumbled an apology, the words sticking uncomfortably in his throat. For a moment, he wanted to reveal himself, to remind this man who he was speaking to. But Marcus reminded himself of his purpose, of the invisibility he'd chosen. He forced a nod, humbly apologized, and moved on, feeling the sting of that single interaction. As the day wore on, he was bombarded with a constant stream of orders, complaints, and dismissals. At one point, a woman in an extravagant fur coldly berated him for bringing her the wrong type of sparkling water. She demanded a manager, and with exaggerated disdain, spoke about him as if he were less than human. Marcus felt each insult acutely. He began to realize just how differently people behaved when they didn't know they were being watched by someone in power. During a brief break, Marcus found himself in the staff room, exhausted and nursing a small blister forming on his heel from his unfamiliar work shoes. The room was filled with other employees, many of whom looked similarly worn out. though they hid it well on the hotel floor. Here, away from the guests and gilded surroundings, Marcus caught fragments of conversations that peeled back the polished veneer he'd taken for granted. One waiter, a wary man named Luce, was talking animatedly to a young woman who looked equally drained. "Man, you know that guy who stays on the penthouse floor? He gave me a 2 tip for carrying all his bags up there. $2, he exclaimed, rolling his eyes. His companion laughed bitterly. "I had a woman last week who refused to look at me while I talked. Just snapped her fingers and waved me away like I was a fly." Marcus listened intently, realizing how frequently his guests seemed to reduce staff to mere servants, invisible parts of the luxury experience. And he was beginning to understand that, in his pursuit of perfection for his guests, he might have ignored the impact on the very people who upheld that image. Just as Marcus was sinking into these reflections, the staff room door opened, and in walked a woman who instantly commanded attention. Her name was Sarah, the head of housekeeping, and Marcus recognized her immediately. Sarah was known to him from countless meetings and reports. Always punctual, always precise. But in person, with her graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, and her sharp eyes surveying the room, she had an aura that was far more formidable than her position suggested. "Sarah," someone muttered under their breath as she walked past. "The eyes and ears of the hotel. If you mess up, she'll know before you do." As she passed, she gave Marcus a brief, evaluating glance. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked. Marcus nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Just started today. Stay sharp," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Guests remember a single mistake longer than 100 flawless services. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He had often repeated the same mantra in meetings with his department heads, stressing excellence above all else. Now, hearing it from her, he realized how tirelessly his staff must work to achieve that standard every single day. As evening fell and the lobby grew quieter, Marcus joined a few of the other waiters for their last tasks. They were a small group, just 3 young men who all shared an unspoken camaraderie, a bond Marcus had long forgotten. As they worked, they began to talk. Eventually, they invited him to join them for a quick late-night drink after their shift. They led him down a back hallway he'd never noticed, winding through the staff quarters to an unmarked door that opened onto a small, dimly lit lounge. It was a hidden corner of the hotel he'd never seen in the plans. A small, unremarkable space tucked away, where a few employees gathered when they needed a break. They called it the hideaway. Over drinks, the young men began to open up, their laughter softening the harsh lines of fatigue on their faces. One of them, Julian, a wary waiter with an infectious grin, began talking about his dreams of opening a small coffee shop someday, far from the glitz and pressure of a luxury hotel. Another, Lucas, had a fiancée he hadn't seen in weeks because their schedules rarely aligned. In that small room, under dim lighting, Marcus felt the raw humanity of his employees for the first time. They weren't simply numbers on a payroll. They were real people with dreams and struggles as vivid as his own. They shared snippets of their lives, their frustrations, and even their rare moments of triumph. And as he listened, Marcus realized how sheltered he had been from the day-to-day lives of the people who worked tirelessly to support his empire. As he left the hideaway later that night, Marcus's mind was racing. He had only completed 1 day, but already he felt as though he had experienced more truth in those few hours than he had in the past decade. His own hotel, his own creation, was full of unseen currents, unspoken sacrifices, and hidden lives, each one woven into the intricate fabric that supported his grand vision. But as he retired to the modest room he'd arranged to stay in for the week, eschewing his usual suite, one thought haunted him. How much of this discontent had grown because of policies he had championed, standards he had set? It was a restless night for Marcus, and as he lay in the unfamiliar bed, he found himself replaying the day's events, each interaction, each small glance that had revealed a different side of his empire. He had come seeking understanding, and now, barely a day into his undercover mission, he could feel the weight of that understanding pressing down on him, demanding more than just silent observation. This was only the beginning. The morning of Marcus's second day as a waiter At the second began with an unexpected jolt. He was still adjusting to the early hours demanded of hotel staff, and the plain, small room where he now stayed left none of the luxury he was accustomed to. There was no sprawling view of Central Park or fresh, pressed linens. Just the dim, unremarkable quarters set aside for visiting staff. As he looked around, he realized how stark the contrast was. Yet it was this very contrast he had set out to experience. After a quick, cold shower and a cup of weak coffee, Marcus ready for another day among his staff. Returning to the hotel lobby, Marcus felt more at ease than the day before. He had familiarized himself with the basic rhythm of his tasks, and he was becoming invisible, blending into the background just as he had hoped. But as he moved through his shift, serving coffee, setting tables, and nodding politely at guests who paid him little attention, he sensed an undertone among the staff, a hint of something brewing just below the surface. At one point, Marcus overheard hushed voices coming from the staff room. Peering through the door, he saw Sarah, the head of housekeeping, standing with Louise and another waiter, Natasha. Their faces were tense, eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Marcus hesitated, debating whether he should interrupt, but the tension in the room was palpable. "I'm just saying," Louise whispered urgently. "It's not fair to expect us to do double the work with the same pay. It's insane. I'm already covering 2 sections." Natasha, a petite woman with tired eyes and an air of quiet resilience, shook her head. "I heard they're planning even more cuts to the staff. If the owners cared at all, they'd know how stretched thin we are. We're not robots." Sarah, the unofficial voice of reason among the staff, lowered her voice. "We'll have to bring this up with management, but I doubt they'll listen. It's always about the bottom line with them." At that moment, Natasha noticed Marcus standing by the door. She frowned, her guard going up. "Hey, new guy, you might want to get to work. They'll be watching. They always are." Feeling the sting of suspicion, Marcus nodded and quickly exited the room. He hadn't expected his employees to be so tightly bound by grievances, nor had he realized just how challenging the workload must be. For the first time, he began to understand the human cost of the polished reputation he had worked so hard to cultivate for the ascendant. In the middle of his shift, Marcus received the unusual request from Peter, the assistant manager and his mentor during this covered stint. "Marcus," Peter said, handing him a tray of finely arranged appetizers. "You're going up to the VP suite on the Penthus floor. It's for Mr. Lasky, one of our oldest and most loyal guests." Peter's tone carried a hint of sarcasm. Peter's expression softened slightly. "Be prepared for anything with him. He's demanding, to put it mildly." Marcus made his way to the suite, tray balanced carefully, wondering what could be so daunting about a single guest. He knew Lasky, of course. The man was a real estate mogul who had been visiting the ascendant for years, spending tens of thousands of dollars every month. Lasky's reputation for difficult behavior was legendary, but Marcus had always assumed it was just idle talk. Now, he would see for himself. As he knocked on the door, Lasky's voice boomed from inside. "Come in. I don't have all day." Marcus entered to find the room in utter chaos. The carpet was littered with half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and plates covered in barely touched food. Lasky lounged on a leather chair, glaring at Marcus with a look of unrestrained disdain. "What took you so long?" he barked, eyeing Marcus from head to toe. "Is this the kind of service I'm paying for?" Marcus stiffened, forcing himself to respond politely. "My apologies, Mr. Lasky. Here are your appetizers." Lasky glanced at the tray with a scowl. "Is this a joke? You think I'm going to eat that? It looks like dog food." He waved Marcus away, spilling half the tray's contents onto the floor. "Clean that up," he ordered, his tone dripping with contempt. As Marcus bent down to pick up the mess, he felt a surge of anger, a visceral sense of indignation. This man was the kind of guest he had always prized. The wealthy, loyal, high-spending type who bolstered the hotel's image. But here, face to face with Lasky's sneering dismissal, Marcus began to see the other side of that equation. The man treated the hotel, and by extension its employees, like an extension of his own ego. For the first time, Marcus wondered how many other guests behaved this way, shielded by wealth and accustomed to privilege. When he finally left the suite, Marcus felt as if he had been slapped. Lasky's words replayed in his mind, mingling with the complaints he had overheard in the staff room earlier. This wasn't the hotel he had imagined, the vision he had built and believed in. It was something darker, something cold. And it felt like his responsibility. As Marcus descended to the staff quarters, after the grueling encounter with Lasky, he felt a strange camaraderie with the employees he passed. He now shared their burdens, even if only temporarily. Over the next few days, he worked his shifts alongside them, taking orders, dealing with minor crises, and overhearing snippets of conversations that painted a clearer picture of their lives. There was Natasha, the single mother who worked extra shifts to pay for her son's medical bills, and Louis, who lived in a cramped apartment with 3 roommates to afford his university tuition. Each one had a story, a struggle that Marcus had never considered in his pursuit of efficiency and excellence. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he realized that the grandeur of the Ascendant was, in many ways, built on the sacrifices of these people. One evening, while taking a short break, Marcus found himself sitting alone in the staff lounge when Sarah entered, carrying a tray of paperwork. She glanced at him and raised an eyebrow, her keen eyes studying him with a hint of curiosity. "You don't seem like the typical new hire," she remarked, settling into a chair across from him. Marcus tried to shrug off the comment, but Sarah's gaze held steady, sharp and unyielding. She leaned forward, her voice soft but unwavering. "You're here for more than just a paycheck, aren't you?" Caught off guard, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't ready to reveal his true identity, but he also couldn't dismiss her question. "I suppose I'm just trying to understand things from a different perspective," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Sarah nodded, as if this answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "Well, you've picked an interesting time for it. Things aren't exactly easy around here, as you've probably noticed." Marcus looked at her, sensing an unspoken weight in her words. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "There's been talk of more layoffs. Cuts to benefits too. Management says it's to boost profits, but we're the ones paying the price." The news hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on running a profitable, efficient business. But now, hearing it framed this way, he realized that the cost of those profits had been shouldered by people like Sarah, Natasha, and Louis, people who had no choice but to endure the consequences of his decisions. Before he could respond, Sarah continued, her voice bitter. "These say the higher-ups want to keep everything run like a well-oiled machine. But to us, it just feels like we're being squeezed dry." Her words lingered in the air long after she left the room, and for the rest of his shift, Marcus found himself replaying them in his mind. He had always thought of the Ascendant as a place of luxury, a sanctuary for the elite. But now, he was beginning to see the cracks in that vision, the invisible lines of strain that stretched beneath the surface. The next day, Marcus arrived early, feeling the weight of his new knowledge pressing down on him. As he walked through the lobby, he noticed Peter, the assistant manager, speaking with a tall, elegantly dressed woman. She looked familiar. Amelia Hart, a rising star in the world of hospitality, known for her bold ideas and innovative approach to management. She was a consultant Marcus had brought in for a series of meetings on profit optimization. Peter spotted Marcus and gestured for him to join them. "Marcus, this is Amelia Hart. She's here to help us improve the hotel's operational efficiency." Amelia extended a hand, her gaze sharp and intelligent. "Nice to meet you," she said, though her tone carried a hint of impatience. "Efficiency is key in the luxury business, as I'm sure you know." Marcus nodded, feeling a strange tension in her presence. He knew her reputation. Amelia was known for her unflinching pragmatism, her willingness to make difficult decisions to maximize profitability. But now, he wondered if her methods had contributed to the growing discontent among his staff, as Amelia spoke with Peter about potential areas for cost-cutting. Marcus listened with a growing sense of unease. Every suggestion, reducing overtime, limiting staff breaks, increasing the pace of work, seemed designed to squeeze more out of employees who were already stretched thin. At one point, Amelia turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You seem new here. What's your take on the workflow?" Marcus hesitated, then chose his words carefully. "It's challenging. I think the staff does a lot with very little support." Amelia raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Support is a luxury in itself. Efficiency means everyone has to pull their weight." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt a flash of anger. He wanted to argue, to tell her that efficiency shouldn't come at the cost of his employees' well-being. But he held back, knowing he had to stay in character. Instead, he gave a noncommittal nod and watched as she turned back to Peter, her tone brisk and unemotional. That night, as Marcus returned to his modest room, he felt a sense of frustration boiling within him. Amelia's words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of the relentless pursuit of profits that had driven him to expand, to push harder, to demand more. But now, after seeing the sacrifices his employees made every day, he could no longer ignore the human cost of his ambition. As he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Marcus realized that his week as a waiter had more than he had bargained for. He had come seeking perspective, but what he found was a mirror, a reflection of his own choices, his own values. And for the first time, he felt the weight of those choices bearing down on him. It was clear to him now, if he wanted the ascendant to the sanctuary he had always envisioned, he would have to confront the painful truth of his own creation. He would have to decide what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not just as a billionaire, not as a leader, and as a human being. This was only the beginning of his transformation. Marcus woke on the third morning with a sense of purpose and a building urgency. His experiences over the past 2 days had opened his eyes to hidden truths about the ascendant, his perfect hotel. For years, he believed built a bastion of luxury, an ideal blending comfort and efficiency, but the reality he was uncovering now was far from the dream he'd cherished. Determined to dig even deeper, Marcus arrived at the lobby and began his shift without fanfare. His disguise, simple, almost bland, allowed him to fade into the background, absorbing the ebb and flow of hotel life in ways he never could before. He worked alongside the housekeeping team for most of the day, shadowing them as they tended to rooms and interacted with guests. As he handled linens, arranged toiletries, and tidied spaces that felt increasingly soulless, he found himself listening closely to the quiet stories and struggles the staff shared. Late in the morning, Sarah, the head of housekeeping, beckoned him over after she noticed him rearranging the toiletries on a guest's vanity. "Hey, new guy, a word of advice," she began, raising an eyebrow at his overly meticulous work. "You'll drive yourself crazy doing it that way. These guests won't notice the difference, and we have twice as many rooms to clean today." Marcus paused, feeling the strain that Sarah had lived with for so long. "Sorry, old habits," he said, smiling faintly, though he knew it was an excuse. Sarah's eyes softened slightly, perhaps sensing the wariness he was beginning to carry. "Look, you seem like a decent enough guy," she said, lowering her voice as she continued. "I'm not sure how long you'll stick around, but I'll give you a heads up. This place, it's not what it looks like." She gestured to the pristine hallways and the expensive decor surrounding them. "You can only polish a surface so many times before the cracks show." Marcus glanced around, his gaze falling on a cracked baseboard near the skirting of the hallway that had gone unnoticed by him, the owner, until now. "How long have you been here, Sarah?" he asked quietly. 10 years, she chuckled, but it was a dry sound, devoid of warmth. "Long enough to know this place inside and out, and long enough to know it's mostly held together by duct tape and a lot of invisible work. People like you and me keep it running, not the suits." He took at her words, and they hung heavy in the air between them. He had expected efficiency from Sarah, but he hadn't anticipated such deep disillusionment. As she left to continue her work, Marcus lingered a moment, realizing that the image he had of the ascendant might be more fragile than he ever imagined. As evening approached, Marcus was scheduled for a dinner service in one of the hotel's private suites, reserved for the wealthiest clients and VIP guests. The exclusive space glittered with chandeliers, with opulent touches everywhere that Marcus knew came a hefty price tag. And tonight, one of his most prized clients was hosting a private dinner party. Marcus had never been one for mingling with the clients at these events, preferring to focus on the numbers and the brand image from afar. But now, he was forced into proximity with the high-powered guests. The host of the evening, Avril Lancaster, was an elite investment banker whose wealth influence had long ago caught Marcus's attention. Though Lancaster was officially retired, his presence in business circles still commanded respect. Tonight he had invited a few prominent guests, famous actors, fashion designers, and venture capitalists. The entire affair was arranged meticulously, down to the floral arrangements and imported wines, all overseen by Amelia Hart, the efficiency consultant Marcus had met the day before. As Marcus set the table, he overheard Amelia giving orders in her clipped, precise tone, berating a junior server for folding the napkins incorrectly. "Presentation is everything," she hissed. "If you can't understand that, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." Marcus felt a surge of resentment as he watched Amelia dismiss the young server. She was ruthless, efficient, and very effective at wringing every ounce of productivity from the team. But the way she spoke to the staff struck him as overly harsh, unyielding, and cold, a stark reminder of his own attitude not long ago. When the dinner began, Marcus took his position by the wall, ready to serve as needed. Throughout the meal, he listened as the guests spoke openly, unaware that their conversations carried to every corner of the room. Lancaster was in the middle of boasting about a recent real estate deal, laughing about how he'd stolen the property from a desperate seller. "People are so willing to sell if you dangle the right numbers in front of them," he said with a smirk. "They only see the immediate profit, never the long game. That's why I win." The group chuckled along, oblivious to the impact their deals had on those they exploited. Marcus found himself growing increasingly tense as the conversations continued. He had built his fortune in a similarly cutthroat world, but he had always believed there was a line he wouldn't cross. Now, though, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable parallels between himself and the people he was quietly serving. How often had he dismissed others in the pursuit of his own success? At one point, Lancaster called out to him, snapping his fingers as if summoning a pet. "Waiter, another round of that Bordeaux, would you?" Marcus complied, maintaining a neutral expression as he poured the wine. As he did, Lancaster leaned back, scrutinizing him with a faint, dismissive smile. "You look familiar," Lancaster said, squinting. "Have you worked here long?" Marcus felt his heart skip, but he maintained his composure. "Just a few days, sir." "Chim," Lancaster said, clearly disinterested. "Well, don't mess up. A place like this requires absolute perfection. Otherwise, what are we paying for?" As Lancaster's attention turned back to his guests, Marcus felt a stab of anger. He had poured his life into making the Ascendant a sanctuary for people like Lancaster, but he was beginning to wonder if he had misunderstood his own vision. Was it truly worth it to cater to clients who saw his staff, and perhaps him, as nothing more than tools in their pursuit of pleasure? After the dinner, Marcus returned to the staff quarters. Weary from the strain of the evening, he slumped into a seat in the lounge, where a few other employees were taking their break. Luce, the young waiter he had spoken to before, sat across from him, his face flushed with fatigue. "That Lancaster guy, I've heard about him," Luis muttered, shaking his head. "You know he made millions off those tenants he evicted last year." Marcus looked at him in surprise. He hadn't heard the story, but the details quickly filled in the blanks. Lancaster was known for his aggressive real estate tactics, often displacing entire communities to redevelop properties for luxury housing. For him, profit was the ultimate goal, no matter the impact on the people whose lives he disrupted. "That's nothing new in this world," Natasha chimed in, leaning back in her chair with a weary sigh. "I have family in Queens, and they're constantly worried about losing their place. These developers buy up everything and turn it into high-end apartments. Where are people supposed to go?" As Marcus listened, a feeling of shame gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on being a different kind of billionaire, someone who valued his people as much as his profits. but as the stories of exploitation and indifference spilled out from his employees. He saw how blind he had been to the consequences of his choices. His focus on efficiency, his drive to attract elite clientele, had come at a steep cost. A cost borne by people like Natasha Lewis and countless others he had never taken the time to know. Later that night, as he returned to his temporary quarters, Marcus felt the weight of his revelation settling heavily on his shoulders. He was realizing, bit by bit, that his legacy was not what he had believed it to be. On the fourth day of his undercover experience, Marcus received an unexpected call from Peter. "We need you down in maintenance," Peter said, his voice tinged with urgency. "There's a plumbing issue in one of the conference rooms, and we're short-staffed." Surprised but determined, Marcus made his way to the maintenance area. He had never handled anything remotely like plumbing in his life, but the maintenance staff quickly taught him the basics. He found himself crawling under sinks, tightening pipes, and mopping up water in conference rooms where some of his highest-profile meetings had taken place. The experience was jarring, yet oddly grounding. The maintenance workers were a different breed from the rest of the hotel staff. Practical, straightforward, and almost brutally honest in their opinions. One of them, an older man named Ralph, was gruff but kind, treating Marcus with unrespected respect. "You don't look like the typical hire," Ralph observed, raising an eyebrow as Marcus fumbled with a wrench. Marcus chuckled, feigning innocence. "I guess I'm still getting used to everything." Ralph grinned, his face weathered and lined from years of hard work. "Well, you learn fast in this job, or you end up knee-deep in water. Just remember one thing, management doesn't care about us down here. We're the invisible ones. And that's just fine by me." The word stung Marcus in a way he hadn't anticipated. Here was a man who had worked tirelessly for years to keep the hotel running, yet he felt invisible, unacknowledged by the very company he had served. Marcus had prided himself on being a hands-on leader, yet here he was face-to-face with a reality he had chosen to ignore. As he continued his work in the maintenance area, his heart felt heavier with every passing hour. He was coming to understand that his hotel, his pride and joy, was built on a foundation of invisible sacrifices, people whose contributions went unnoticed and unrewarded. And in that moment, he felt something shift within him, determination to change. That night, Marcus lay awake in his modest room, grappling with the magnitude of his revelations. The world he had constructed was a glittering facade, sustained by people who toiled in obscurity, who gave their time, energy, and spirit to create an illusion of perfection. He could no longer deny the truth. The Ascendant had become a place of luxury for the elite, but it had also become a place of silent hardship for those who kept it running. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, one thought burned in his mind: he could no longer pretend ignorance. His employees deserved more, and he would find a way to make things right. For too long, he had placed profits above people, efficiency above empathy. Now, he was beginning to see the way forward. Tomorrow, he decided, he would confront Amelia, the efficiency consultant, and bring his true intentions to light. It was time to turn his vision inward, to rebuild the Ascendant from the inside out. Not for the elite, but for the invisible foundation that had supported it all along. By the fourth day of his experiment as a waiter, Marcus Thorne felt like a man divided between two worlds. On the one hand, he was still the billionaire owner of the Ascendant, a man known for his relentless pursuit of success. On the other, he was Mark, the anonymous waiter who quietly bore witness to the invisible struggles of his staff. Each day peeled back a new layer of what he had once believed to be a flawless machine, and each revelation weighed heavily on him. That morning, as Marcus stepped into the lobby, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Staff members whispered to each other, their faces tense with concern. It didn't take long for him to overhear the cause of the tension. Rumor was circulating that layoffs were imminent. A corporate restructuring aimed at cutting costs was set to hit the hotel, spearheaded by Amelia Hart, the efficiency consultant he'd met earlier. He'd hired Amelia with the idea of increasing profits, but he had never intended to jeopardize the livelihoods of his employees. Yet here they were, fearing for their jobs. The reality of it struck him like a blow. He had, in a way, set these events into motion. Now, he would have to confront the very changes he had once advocated for. But this time, he would do it from a different perspective. During his break, Marcus made his way to the employee lounge, where he found Sarah sitting with a cup of coffee. Her usually unflinching gaze softened with fatigue. She looked up as he entered, gesturing for him to sit beside her. "Things feel different today," he remarked, studying her expression. Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, I suppose you've heard. They're saying Amelia is cutting staff, starting with the housekeeping team, and we're already stretched thin." Marcus felt a pang of guilt. He had brought Amelia in with the idea of creating efficiency, but he now saw that this efficiency often came at the expense of human lives and well-being. "I didn't realize it was affecting you all so directly," he replied carefully, not wanting to give away too much. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Mark, people like me, we don't have options. I've been here for 10 years. This job is my lifeline. I don't have a fancy degree or connections. I can't just go out and find another place that pays me even this much." She sighed, looking away as if embarrassed by her vulnerability. "I've given so much to this place, but it feels like none of it matters." Marcus absorbed her words, feeling the weight of her experience, her loyalty, and the frustration she harbored. He saw, perhaps for the first time, that for many of his employees, the Ascendant wasn't just a job. It was their entire world. He had spent years pushing his team to meet impossible standards, all while ignoring the human toll it took. Determined to address the situation directly, Marcus sought out Amelia Hart. He found her in her temporary office, surrounded by spreadsheets and documents detailing the hotel's financials. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. "Amelia," he began, keeping his voice calm, "I heard that you're planning to implement layoffs in housekeeping and maintenance." Amelia raised an eyebrow, her expression unapologetic. "That's right. We're working to streamline costs. Labor is one of the largest expenses, and there are areas where we can reduce hours and increase efficiency." He clenched his fists, fighting back the urge to reveal his identity and condemn her methods outright. Instead, he forced himself to listen, to understand her perspective. He had, after all, once believed in this kind of ruthless efficiency. "And what about the people this impacts?" he asked, his voice tense. "Have you considered what these cuts will mean for them?" She sighed, glancing at him with a mixture of impatience and condescension. "Mark, I don't expect you to understand this. The bottom line is what keeps this place running. It's not personal, it's business. People will find other jobs. They always do." Her words ignited something in him, a realization that he had once shared this same mindset. But after his week in the trenches, he knew how hollow that reasoning truly was. "Not everyone can just find another job," he replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "These people are giving everything to this hotel. Don't you think they deserve more than a number on a spreadsheet?" Amelia gave him a bemused look, clearly surprised by his impassioned response. "Interesting perspective for a waiter," she remarked coolly. "But I'm here to do a job. And if that means making tough decisions, then so be it." As he left her office, Marcus's heart pounded with frustration. Amelia's cold pragmatism was a mirror of his past self, and the reflection unsettled him deeply. He knew that he could no longer stand by and let his staff suffer because of decisions he'd once encouraged. He had seen their dedication, their sacrifices, and their resilience. They weren't numbers. They were people with lives, dreams, and struggles. Later that day, Marcus sought out Peter, the assistant manager who had been overseeing his undercover experience. Peter was in his office, buried in paperwork, but he looked up with a smile as Marcus entered. "Hey Mark, how's it going?" Peter asked, leaning back in his chair. Marcus hesitated before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Peter, what do you think about the staff cuts Amelia is planning?" Peter's face fell, and he glanced around as if to make sure they were alone. "It's a nightmare. Morale's already low, and with these cuts, we're risking an exodus. People are scared, and they're already overworked. I don't see how this helps the hotel in the long run." Marcus nodded, relieved to hear that Peter shared his concerns. If you had the chance, what would you suggest instead? Peter considered this for a moment. Well, if I had any say in it, I'd recommend focusing on training and retention. Treat the staff like they matter. Invest in them, and they'll give back tenfold. But that's not the kind of thing corporate wants to hear. Hearing Peter's words, Marcus felt a surge of determination. This was it, the path forward. The Ascendant didn't need more cost, cutting measures, or soulless efficiency. It needed heart. It needed leaders who understood the value of the people who made it thrive. As he left Peter's office, Marcus felt a newfound resolve hardening within him. He was ready to take action, and he knew exactly what he needed to do. As he was about to head back to the staff quarters, Marcus was stopped by a familiar face, Louis, the young waiter he'd befriended. Louis looked troubled, glancing over his shoulder as if he didn't want anyone to overhear. "Mark, I heard about the layoffs," he whispered, his voice filled with worry. "I can't lose this job. My tuition, I'm barely keeping up as it is." A desperation in Louis's voice struck Marcus to his core. He had once been that ambitious young man, willing to do anything to secure a future. Now, he had the power to protect people like Louis, but only if he stepped up. "Don't worry, Louis," he said, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "I'll do everything I can to help." Louis nodded, a spark of hope in his eyes. As he walked away, Marcus realized that he wasn't just fighting to save a hotel or improve working conditions. He was fighting for the people who depended on him, the ones who had trusted him without ever knowing who he truly was. That evening, as Marcus sat alone in his temporary room, he replayed the events of the past days in his mind. He had learned more about the Ascendant in a single week than he had in all the years he had owned it. He had seen the struggles, the sacrifices, and the quiet resilience of the people who made his hotel what it was. The only way forward was clear. He would have to reveal his identity and confront Amelia, the corporate team, and everyone else involved in making decisions for the Ascendant. But this time, he would speak not as the distant billionaire owner, but as someone who had walked in their shoes. He was ready to stand up for the people who had supported him, to fight for a future that honored their contributions. The morning light crept through the window as Marcus made his way back to his office, feeling both a sense of peace and a fierce determination. He was ready to be the leader they needed, to transform the Ascendant into a place where people were valued, not just for their labor, but for who they were. Tomorrow, he would return to his world, but he would do so with a promise to rebuild it from the inside out. The legacy he had once sought as a monument to his own power would now be dedicated to the people who had made that legacy possible. The real journey was just beginning. On the last day of his week as a waiter, Marcus Thorne felt the weight of everything he had experienced pressing down on him. His journey as Mark, the anonymous hotel staffer, had pulled him into a world he had never truly seen before, a world of hard work, dedication, and silent sacrifices made by the people who upheld his empire. Now, he was more determined than ever to act. He would no longer be the distant, demanding executive who pushed for relentless efficiency without understanding its impact. He was ready to confront the leadership of the Ascendant, beginning with Amelia Hart and his corporate team, to reclaim his hotel's values. As he made his way back to his office, for the first time in a week, Marcus felt a sense of purpose more profound than any he'd felt before. This wasn't just about profitability or brand prestige. It was about building a legacy that valued people and honored their contributions. Before he spoke to Amelia and the corporate board, Marcus knew he owed the staff an explanation. They had worked alongside him, sharing their struggles and frustrations, trusting him without knowing who he really was. Now, it was time to repay that trust with honesty. As he entered the staff lounge, the room quieted. Familiar faces turned to him in surprise, and Sarah, the head of housekeeping, raised an eyebrow. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of their attention. "I know you all know me as Mark, the new waiter," he began, his voice steady. "But that's not who I really am. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I am the owner of the Ascendant." A wave of shocked silence swept through the room, and Sarah's face transformed from surprise to something more thoughtful. Louis and Natasha exchanged stunned glances, and a few staff members looked almost betrayed. I know this must come as a shock, Marcus continued, but I came here to see the reality of my own hotel from their perspective. Over the past week, I've seen the challenges you face, the hard work you put in, and the ways you are often overlooked and unappreciated. I realized that I needed to understand what it takes to keep this place running. Not from my office, but from your side. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Sarah broke the silence. So, what are you going to do with all that understanding, Mr. Thorne? She asked, her tone guarded but hopeful. Marcus met her gaze, a new resolve in his eyes. I'm going to make changes, starting today. There will be no layoffs, no more cuts to hours or benefits. Instead, I'm committed to investing in you. All of you. You're the reason this place works, and it's time we start treating you with the respect and appreciation you deserve. A murmur of relief and cautious optimism spread through the room, and he could see the beginnings of trust in their faces. They weren't ready to believe him entirely, but he could feel that they wanted to, and that was enough for now. Marcus's next stop was Amelia's office, where she was finalizing the restructuring plans he had authorized months ago. When he entered, Aaliyah looked up, surprised and slightly irritated. She hadn't expected him to return so soon, certainly not with the unyielding determination that now radiated from him. Marcus. She began, recovering her composure. I didn't realize you were back. I was just finishing the cost-cutting plan. Once we reduce the labor expenses. He held up a hand, cutting her off. There will be no layoffs, Amelia. And the cost-cutting plan is off the table. Amelia's eyes narrowed, her tone shifting to one of forced patience. Marcus, we discussed this. If we want to maintain profitability, we need to make these changes. Labor costs are the largest expense, and without adjustments. No. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. I've spent the past week working alongside the people you want to cut. I've seen the sacrifices they make, the lives they lead. They aren't numbers, Amelia. They're human beings, and they deserve better than this. Amelia opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus continued before she could speak. I don't want my legacy to be about maximizing profits at the expense of people. If that means profits take a hit in the short term, so be it. I want to invest in the team, provide real benefits, real training, and train an environment where people feel valued. Amelia's expression shifted, her surprise giving way to thinly veiled frustration. Marcus, that's a noble sentiment, but you're risking everything you've built. No, he replied quietly but firmly. I'm protecting what I've built. The Ascendant is nothing without its people. Amelia shook her head, clearly unwilling to accept his decision. This is a mistake, she muttered, gathering her papers. If you go down this path, you'll find it harder to compete. Marcus met her gaze unflinching. Then I'll find a new way to compete. But I will no longer sacrifice people for profits. My mind is made up. Realizing she couldn't change his decision, Amelia reluctantly gathered her things and left, her parting look one of skepticism and irritation. Marcus watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. He knew that Amelia's efficiency-driven approach had once mirrored his own, but he was no longer that man. He had finally stepped beyond the narrow vision that had guided him for so long. Over the next few weeks, Marcus threw himself into revamping the Ascendant from the inside out. He organized meetings with each department, listening to their feedback and learning about the support they needed. He implemented new training programs, improved health benefits, and adjusted schedules to provide better work-life balance. He even initiated a profit-sharing plan, allowing employees to receive a portion of the hotel's profits, a decision that was met with gratitude and cautious optimism. Marcus also made sure that his managers understood his new vision. He wanted them to see themselves not as enforcers of efficiency, but as leaders who genuinely supported their teams. He emphasized empathy and respect, encouraging his managers to build relationships with the people under their care. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere Ascendant began to change. The transformation wasn't easy. There were setbacks, frustrations, and unexpected challenges. Some employees remained skeptical, their trust understandably damaged by years of feeling unseen. But day by day, Marcus worked to rebuild that trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, genuine actions. One evening, as he walked through the lobby, he saw Louise and Natasha chatting by the front desk. When they noticed him, they smiled, and Natasha gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Marcus felt a surge of pride, knowing that he had earned a measure of respect not as their boss, but as someone who had finally begun to understand them. Months later, the Ascendant had become a different place. It was still luxurious, still sophisticated, but there was a warmth to it that hadn't been there before. A sense of community and belonging. Guests began to notice the difference too, commenting on the attentiveness and genuine smiles of the staff. The hotel's reputation grew, not just as a place of luxury, but as a place where people mattered. Marcus often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, on the decision to step away from power and see his empire through new eyes. He realized that he hadn't just changed the Ascendant, he had changed himself. The relentless drive for success that had once consumed him had softened, tempered by an understanding of what it truly meant to lead. One evening, as he stood in the lobby watching his staff, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had built something far more valuable than a hotel. He had built a legacy rooted in respect, compassion, and humanity. Sarah, now promoted to Director of Guest Services, approached him with a warm smile. "You know, you've really turned this place around," she said. "We're all proud to work here. Proud to work for you." Marcus smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. But I think I'm the lucky one. I have a team that's more valuable than I ever realized." As he looked around, he knew that he had finally found the legacy he wanted to leave behind. The Ascendant was no longer just a monument to his ambition. It was a place where people thrived, where they were seen, and where they belonged. And that, he knew, was worth more than any fortune.